talking. So Sharif's going to say a couple things about Marc after I'm done, but he's been working with Sharif and I since he married us, and we've had some pretty outrageous, loving successes. So we just want to introduce this theology into the world and change what sucks, basically. So thank you for joining. And here's Sharif.
Okay, well, I'm going to keep it very brief. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Hello there. Hey, Jill, how are you? Hey, I'm glad you joined us. So, I mean, in a nutshell, Dr. Gafni is a great thinker, Oxford professor, and runs a think tank, and with a lot of really smart people from around the world. And their goal is, after identifying true existential risk, it's a very lofty goal. It's to change the source code of the world, right? And he's going to describe, because I won't do it justice, on how to do that. But certainly his 13 volumes of books that he's written, and probably the next 25 books that are slated to be written, are part of that, creating a library of what the world, how the world should be run, and based upon what values and ethics. And so with that, I will let the much more lucid and illustrious,
none of the above,
Dr. Gafni.
Thank you, Sharif, and thank you, Gabrielle. It's a delight to be with you. It's a delight, and it's a moment of enormous gravitas. It's a big moment. It's an important moment. And so perhaps what I'll do, with everyone's permission, and welcome everyone, I'm just going to ask everyone to mute for a second. There's still a little kind of, a couple of people not muted. You kind of hear all those little gentle noises. So it'd be awesome. You press that little mute button and your voice will be heard in Cosmos, but your surface voice will be muted. Super thanks. Okay, super thanks to everyone, okay? Just a couple more people, just to kind of press your mute button, and maybe Suzette, you can keep track of that. We're getting all sorts of feedback.
Yeah, I'm going to put Dawn in the meeting room, in the out room, because that's where that's coming from. So sorry,
Okay,
Dawn.
let's do that. Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, fantastic. Awesome. Thank you so much, Suzette, for your help. Totally appreciated. Let me try and set the context. We're going to go for about 60 minutes. So in 60 minutes, we're going to be done, and we're going to try and change the world in 60 minutes. So the think tank that, and I want to just be delighted and thank, on behalf of our entire board, our new board chairs, who are Sharif Malnik and Gabriel Anwar. So just delighted to be with you and to be in this story. I started the think tank with a close colleague, Ken Wilber, who's kind of the best read philosopher in the world today, an integral philosopher, with a friend named John Mackey, who's a grocer. He runs a little shop called Whole Foods. And Barbara Marx Hubbard, who's probably, Buckminster Fuller described her as the best informed human being alive today about the future. There's a great group of people. And there are about 60, 70 people involved in the think tank around the world. And I want to try and share with you what we're doing, because it probably doesn't match any of the visions you have about what an organization does. So stay slow with me and stay quick, and we'll dive in. We're not at a normal time. We're at what we described last time, and I'm going to spend maybe 10, 12 minutes recapitulating in a different way where we entered last time. Jeffrey, it's great to see you, right? See you over there. Okay, so we're gonna enter there, and then we're gonna expand from there. But let me just kind of start with a recapitulation to kind of get a sense of where we are. So imagine you're in the Renaissance. Pre-modernity is over. That is to say, the notion of exclusive religions in which each one says, we're running the game, we have an exclusive relationship, all the others are delegitimate, pre-human rights, pre-feminism, pre-scientific method, pre-modern art, right? Pre-everything, pre-modern world. So the pre-modern world is breaking down, it's ending. The Black Death hits Europe, destroys between half, a third of Europe, spreads into Asia. There's decimation and devastation. It's a time between worlds. It's a time between stories. Reality is at what Rilke called a pivoting point. And it's impossible for Davinci and Marcello Ficinio and Galileo and their cohorts in the Renaissance. They can't go to every village that's destroyed by the Black Death and heal everyone because they don't have resources. And yet they're massively distraught by the enormity of the suffering. And what they understand at that moment is that they have to tell a new story. And what I mean by a new story is not a fanciful conjecture, but a new story of reality that integrates all of the best information available until that moment in time. And that essentially, friends, is what the Renaissance was. The Renaissance was a retelling of the story of humanity, integrating from all the different disciplines available into a new synergy, meaning a new whole, greater than the sum of the parts, which is emergent, which actually births something undeniably new. And that new story, all of us, every single person on this phone call, has been completely recast by that new story. Universal human rights, the dignity of the feminine, the dignity of every individual human being, the very notion of individualism, the scientific method, the appreciation of individuated creativity, right? Technology, modern medicine, right? Everything that is a axiomatic dimension of our lives comes from that new story. All of the dignities of modernity, but stay close, but also the disasters of modernity. Because modernity has birthed dignities and it's birthed disasters. As we went from 500 million people 150 years ago to 7.x billion people, as we moved from classical technologies to exponential technologies, right? As we moved to a material, right, a linear materials economy, which is an open loop system, right? Which is based on an extraction model, which extracts from the earth in 60, 70 years, what it took, some several billion years to create. As the gap widens between have and have-nots, as we have non-state actors who have available to them exponential technologies, right? As right, the very structures of the world that we built in modernity is actually being exposed in its fault lines. In other words, something went wrong. The new story of modernity had great dignity. It birthed enormous good, but it also birthed enormous disaster. That is to say, it took us to this moment in time, and I want to describe this moment in time as what we might call the second shock of existence. Now, last week, I spent, almost an hour, last Salon, almost an hour detailing the dimensions of the second shock of existence. I won't do that again, but let me just give you just a general sense of it. What's the first shock of existence? So if you have a sense of history and anthropology, whether you have it from reading sacred texts, right? My original place where I originally study, and I study, still every day, every night, is Aramaic texts, right? I was born and raised deep in the world of Aramaic texts and wrote, 6 or 7 books, just in the world of Aramaic texts, what's called Hasidism and Kabbalah, Talmud. But I then branched out to molecular biology and physics and the different schools of physics and the 4 or 5 major schools of economics and anthropology, the world's great traditions. So if you kind of get a sense, right, of kind of where we are in this moment in time today, let's try and integrate the information and try and get a sense of where we are. Where are we? We're at this moment of second shock of existence, which means that not the first shock of existence, which happens at the dawn of humanity, which is the realization of the death of the individual human being. When we go from being biological creatures to human creatures, when the self-reflective human mind emerges and we realize that the skull grins at the banquet, we have enormous historical record of how and when this happened. There's this realization of death as an existential reality. Death presses us inward, and we actually disclose the greatest spiritual discoveries of humankind, the greatest scientific discoveries. All science, all art, all spirit emerges from the first shock of existence. Then what happens? We go through all the successive structures of humanity. We get to modernity. Modernity explodes with its great new story, the story of modernity, which we just described, universal human rights, the feminine scientific method, etc. But then that story births all the new technologies, which then take us to the second shock of existence. Now, what's the second shock of existence? The second shock of existence is the realization not of the potential death of the individual human being, but the death of humanity. Now, that's a big deal, and it's very hard to wrap yourself around. And actually, all of the great traditions, by the way, so whatever great tradition you might be from, and my guess is probably more people from the Jewish great tradition here than any other, right, intuitively, right? But all the great traditions, massive Kabbalistic texts that talk about the potential death of humanity. So don't think you got protection from some sacred tradition. We don't. That's a definite live option in the sacred texts. But we've actually come to this point where we actually stand before the second shock of existence, meaning there's a set of catastrophic risks and existential risks. Existential risk meaning risk to the very existence of the future, right? That actually define reality. And not to realize that's true is actually to be asleep. I've spent the last 10 years with a group of 40, 50 thinkers looking at the second shock of existence. Several years ago, we described the pandemic, right? It would come somewhere around now. That was actually one of the minor catastrophic risks, but it was clear that it was on the way. But that's just a dress rehearsal, right? The level of existential risk we face is actually shocking, so much so that it's legitimate to say, for example, Toby Ord, Oxford University, who wrote a recent book called Existential Risk and does the math, it's reasonable to say that if we don't change course in some significant way, there's at least a 50% chance that in X amount of time, we will not be engaged in humanity as we know it. That's not a sci-fi scenario. That's not a dystopian novel. That's hard facts based on a careful accounting, right, of the set of existential and catastrophic risks that are available. Now, that's so hard to wrap your mind around, right? It's unimaginable. You just can't even like, what does that mean? But not to wrap our minds around it is to actually violate the covenant between the generations. And the covenant between the generations says that we actually take responsibility not only for the past, we're not just reverentially loyal to the past, we're not just living and engaging the present, but we're actually in some significant real way taking responsibility for the future. And that's what we call, right, in Hebrew wisdom, it's called covenant. I'm translating from Aramaic, a covenant between the generations. There's a covenant in which the voice of the future is us, right? We are a memory of the future, right? And actually to recover our sanity, we have to access a memory of the future, be able to access in a genuine and real way how the future is going to unfold and how we can impact it. Now, let me try and make this more real. Okay, so up till now, we're just relaxed, a couple of relaxing conversations, death of humanity. Let's make it more real. Let's see if we can kind of see it at play, right, in some real way. All civilizations fail, right? There's no civilization that hasn't fallen. The difference between our civilization and any other civilization is that our civilization is global, number one. Number two, it's exponential, meaning it's defined by exponential technology. And that exponential technology, right, is no longer run by governments that share any sense of value. It's run by disparate governments that are engaged in rivalrous conflict with each other. And an enormous amount of non-state actors have access, right, to that exponential technology. So we're not talking about a B-52 bomber, right? We're talking about exponential technology, right, that's widely available, meaning to at least 10,000 people approximately today, that can actually destroy reality without any sort of shared language between people that would govern how we relate to each other or how we relate to that technology. So let me try and say it a little differently. We basically live at a moment of a global civilization exponential technology, which causes exponential destruction, that is to say, there is no future, without sufficient interior technologies that would allow us to respond to the exterior exponential technology. And by interior technologies, I mean, we lack a shared story of value, right? We lack anything that would activate what we would call global coherence. I just spent a few weeks ago, I spoke to the #1 guy at the Pentagon who was responsible for developing many of our systems to interfere with potential nuclear attack. And I spent several hours talking to him about this exact issue, which is what they're thinking about, which is global coherence. How do you actually activate global coherence? Meaning, how do we activate being able to operate and sync together in response to global threats? Now, what's clear from COVID, for example, is that we utterly failed to do that. We've got a COVID disease that clearly is transboundary, not limited by boundary in any sense, shape, or form whatsoever. And yet the different countries all articulate a complete different approach to how you deal with COVID, even though clearly the only way to deal with it effectively, because it's actually a virus that's transmitted, that transcends boundaries, that knows no national allegiances, the only possible way to have dealt with COVID would have been a meeting last January when we knew COVID was coming. We actually knew probably by early December. We should have created a global meeting, a global summit, created a global set of protocols, which would have saved, according to best estimates, probably 1 million of the lives lost. And we're talking about a minor example of catastrophic risk, not even a major one, let alone we're not talking about existential risk, right? That meeting, that summit literally never happened. It's kind of shocking. Even though we could have easily done it, everyone could have come together. We couldn't because we couldn't activate coherence, right? Why couldn't we activate coherence? We couldn't activate coherence because, and if you have been listening up till now, step in now. That was kind of a general introduction. Why didn't we activate coherence? We couldn't activate coherence, friends, because there's a global intimacy disorder. At the core of reality today is what we might call a global intimacy disorder at its very core. What does that mean? It means that the core narrative of reality enacted by modernity doesn't allow for a global conversation, doesn't allow for a shared grammar of value, doesn't allow for a shared story. None of that is allowed, because what's the core narrative that was introduced by modernity into reality that literally defines reality in every country in the world today? And it's that core narrative which is one of the 2 generator functions for existential risk. The core narrative is rivalrous conflict. Rivalrous conflict. Rivalrous conflict governed by a win-lose metrics, or said differently, a success story governed by a win-lose metrics. The notion of a success story in which there's a win-lose metrics, that is to say rivalrous conflict, defines every relationship between all sets of people on the planet today. That's a very big deal. It means within departments, between individuals in a family system, between countries, between religions, right? Between agencies of government. There's a fundamental success story, win-lose metrics, which is the governing ethic. You don't have intrinsic value. Your value is determined by your ability to commodify in a particular way that generates particular returns, which are financial. Right? That's the basic, right? Without that, you don't have intrinsic value, right? Period. End of story. Your value is determined by your ability to succeed, right? In a win-lose metrics, which is defined by this notion of rivalrous conflict. And that moves all the way up and all the way down. That's the first major generator function of existential risk. And the second generator function, pointed out by systems theory, is the difference between a complex and a complicated system. What's a complicated system? A complicated system is a Ferrari, for example, or the global economy, meaning the pieces don't actually fit together. You've cobbled them together, but there's no essential connection between the parts. A complex system, let's say a Brazilian rainforest, means there's an essential connection. There's a larger system at play. Let's go a little deeper. In a complex system, there's allurement between the parts. There's attraction between the parts. There's an inherent allurement that drives the system. In a complicated system, right, there's an intimacy disorder at play. there's no essential allurement between all the parts in the system. Because there's no essential allurement, you get a complicated system, which is vast, spread out. The system is not anti-fragile, right? It optimizes for efficiency, not for resiliency, and therefore it breaks down. Those two pieces, number one, a win-lose metrics, rival risk conflict, generator function, the success story, one, that's the core story which actually unites the planet today. Number two, right, our exponential technology has generated non-intimate systems, meaning systems which are complicated. It's Snowden's term, by the way, in systems theory, not complex, in which there's no essential allurement between the parts. Those two generator functions together, right, generate, right, essentially the collapse of human society, the second shock of existence. Now, I apologize, I completely do, for kind of not telling like 6 great jokes, right, to kind of mitigate that. So you totally deserve that. But that's actually the structure of where we are. And I'd actually, with your permission, gently want to be shocking for a second. Because either we take a seat at the table of history and we actually engage covenantal responsibility with great joy, not with fear, with concern, but with joy, right? The privilege of taking our seat at the table, of actually stepping out from our myopic view in our particular worlds. Whatever we do some good stuff. We've got great families. We're doing some philanthropy, right? We're rearranging in very beautiful ways the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, but we're actually not engaging existential risk, right? Or catastrophic risk in any serious way. And we think there's a room somewhere where people are talking about this. Well, there's not, right? Some of the intelligence communities that we're in touch with have started to think about this in relatively superficial terms, but they haven't even begun to actually identify as clearly as we did just now, the generator functions of existential risk, right? They're actually operating at a kind of surface level, a surface structural level, and not at a root cause generator function level. And so we got to begin to actually operate at a generator function level. Now, you might say, really? On a Zoom call hosted by Sharif and Gabriel? Is this like for real? Well, it is, right? The way reality changes is that groups of people come together, right? They actually take on, right, a pressing issue of the day. They put all of their love and all of their open heart and all of their passion, all their energy into it, and they try and master it in some way. And then from that periphery, right, you actually move towards the center and you engage, you actually change the trajectory of reality. And that's the kind of moment we're in now. So, I mean, imagine for a second that you're in that moment in which the caterpillar wants to become a butterfly. What happens? You all know the process, right? When a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, the caterpillar is bloated. The systems are breaking down, right? Nothing's quite working. The interior structures turn to soup and the caterpillar hangs itself upside down in a chrysalis. And then what happens in the chrysalis is, strangely, these cells that are actually called imaginal cells begin to emerge. Single-celled organisms that are different than the immune system of the caterpillar. So the caterpillar goes to kill each of the single-celled organisms that arise. So what happens is those imaginal cells, each that are completely independent, begin to clump together. They begin to create coherence. They're allured to each other, and they create imaginal cell clumps. Then those clumps begin to cluster, and then slowly, the entire interior structure, the source code, if you will, of the caterpillar is reconfigured in a completely different set of stories, a completely different set of intimacies in the interior structure, and you have a butterfly. So in some sense, if you want to think about it that way, we're imaginal cells, right? The think tank, the Center for Inner Wisdom, is an imaginal cell. And we're in touch with, let's say, the Center for Existential Risk in Oxford. And we're talking to a group of people at the Pentagon, and we're talking to, right? But it's the beginning of a conversation. And in this conversation, what we're trying to do is say, how do we actually change the game? Right? And here's where it starts to get really exciting. And here's where it starts to get like wildly hopeful. And it requires, right, an opening of imagination. Because really, where we are today is we have this global intimacy disorder, and we have this crisis of imagination. And we can't quite imagine or find our way to identify, right? What are the core generator functions? So the core generator function of existential risk is a failed story. Modernity, right? Generates universal human rights, right? Generates the dignity of the feminine, right? Generates the scientific method, right? Generates, right, modern medicine, right? All the things we've already listed twice before in this conversation. But what does it not generate? It doesn't generate a universal grammar of value, right? A new story in which the entire world can come on board. So instead, we have multiple 15, 20 different stories, but virtually all of them are either pre-modern, meaning it's a pre-modern religion claiming that it's triumphant, or it's a modern story which says there is no shared grammar of value, and my job is to be in a success story, right? And the success story, right, creates the extraction model, right? And the extraction model creates exponential growth curves. And exponential growth curves always fall off, because that's what they do. And exponential technology, right, is, right, the result of, right, all of the exponential growth curves. The growth curves fall off, the system collapses one way or the other. And again, last week I went through the 10 specific ways, right, in which actually the system will interior implode, right? I'm not going to do that this week. Let's talk about now, where do we go? Where's the excitement? Where's the game? What do we need to do? How do we respond? And there's nothing more wildly exciting than our capacity to actually respond to this moment, right, with a new set of interior technologies that can actually, in some fundamental way, change the game. Now, what would those interior technologies be? Okay, and here's where it gets like wildly exciting. And I want to talk in the language, if we can, of second simplicity. Not first simplicity, but second simplicity. First simplicity, simple sloganeering, not helpful. Level 2, complexity, all the different complex variables from all the different systems. Second simplicity, I want to absorb, integrate, right, all of the information we have from pre-modernity and all of its wisdom streams, from modernity and all of its wisdom streams, post-modernity's insight and all of its wisdom streams. I want to integrate all of that material in a language of second simplicity and try and articulate, literally in 20 minutes, what is the response to existential risk? Okay, that's a big deal. Okay, so first I just want to thank you. I know I did something which was impossible in the last 25 minutes. It was probably a little bit abstract, like what are we talking about? So I just want to thank you for your presence, right, and the depth and the dignity and the beauty of just the attention field that we're in. So thank you. Okay, so I want to just stop for a second. I just want to ask, before I kind of jump into the next step, are there any kind of burning questions in the space where, like, if you don't get this resolved, if you don't have this handled, right, you can't go on? So there's something, it's like complete inexplicable, doesn't make any sense. You need that handled. So if there's anyone like that, unmute yourself, throw it in the space. I'll be glad to respond and we'll move on. Just want to kind of have that break for a second. So anybody? I'm just looking around here. Christina, next to Christina is Craig. Then there's Mr. Stein, Norm, right? Jeffrey, right? Dawn, right? Natasha, I'm looking on Lindsay, right? Anyone has anything that's kind of super pressing that you can't move without it? Anybody? You good? Everyone good? You got the basic structure, right? Second shock of existence, existential risk, exponential technology, all civilizations fall. This is a global civilization. It's an exponential civilization. All civilizations fall because of rivalrous conflict. We haven't solved rivalrous conflict. Our basic story, success story, governed by a win-lose metrics, right? We have vast, complicated, fragile systems, not complex systems governed by a shared allurement, right? That's the core structure, right, of existential risk, kind of beneath the headlines, okay? So how do we respond to it? And here's what actually gets wildly exciting. We actually have the capacity to respond, and in a very unique way. And clearly, the only thing that's ever changed the trajectory of history is a news story. Only a news story changes the game. We know that historically. You know, one of my colleagues who we're writing a major book kind of essentially debunking what he did in 2 of his books, right? But the books are good, but they're based on massive amount of fallacious assumptions. The books are called Homo Sapiens and Homo Deus by my colleague Yuval Harari. It's what Yuval does is, and the reason this book sold enormously, 14 million copies, right? Thick books. Why did they sell? Because Yuval was telling a story. And for the first time, someone was trying to link the story from the beginning to the end. And Yuval's correct point in those books, which is unbelievably important, is that we know historically that the only thing that ever changes the trajectory of history is a new story. It's only a new organizing story or a new worldview, right? A new organizing set, right, of narratives that changes the story. So what was modernity, right? What was that Davinci moment? The Davinci moment is Da Vinci tells a new story. A new story of what? A new story of the universe, new universe story, a new narrative of identity, a new story of identity, a new narrative of desire, a new narrative of power, and a new narrative of community, meaning a new story of who am I? A new story of who are we, right? A new story of what are we supposed to be doing together, right? A new story of what's the nature of our power and how do we engage our power, right? A new story of eros and desire. And essentially, Da Vinci tells a new set of stories. And so in this Da Vinci moment, right, in this time between worlds, the invitation is, can we tell a new set of stories? So I want to just throw that sentence at you again. In this Da Vinci moment, in this time between worlds, in this time between stories, can we tell a new set of stories? Now, let's just double click for a second. The new set of stories can't be Jewish or Muslim, right, or Christian, or a particular form of Christian, or a particular form of secular humanism. That's not going to work. It's not that the individual stories don't matter. They do. I, for example, put on tefillin, phylacteries every morning. I'm completely committed in my own personal practice to a particular story that has great value. That's immutably magnificent. But that story is not going to become the story of humanity. Right? The way to tell a new story is to integrate the best insights of all the wisdom streams, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, into a new whole, a new story that's greater than the sum of the parts. Now, imagine for a second, you're in a relationship, right? So I was just working with a couple that lives in Belgium, great couple, right? And we've been talking for about a year, and it turns out that their story about the relationship, they've been together 18 years, great couple, but their story about the relationship is fundamentally different. They each have a different story of what happened over the last 18 years. And so what happens is, although they're semi-functional, they can't be coherent because there's no core intimacy. If you don't have a shared story about how it all happened, about how it all emerged, you can't create intimacy. If you can't create intimacy, you can't create coherence. So global coherence can only happen when we solve the global intimacy disorder. We can only solve the global intimacy disorder, right? The Archimedean lever, right? The linchpin, the pivoting point, the move that actually has the most leverage is to actually tell a new story. But again, not a fanciful story, not a fundamentalist story, not a new age story, not a story you're declaring, but actually we take the best validated insights of every field of science, the 11 major schools of psychology, the major schools of economics, right? The best insights of the great traditions, right? The interior sciences, and we weave them together at a level of second simplicity, heavily footnoted, but you got to be able to tell the story at a level of second simplicity. And you actually change the source code of culture. Now, for good and for bad, if you remember, we talked about last time, Darwin did that, Freud did that, Marx did that, and Einstein did that. Those are the four major names of the 20th century. Who else do you remember? Right? That's actually the way it works, right? Actually, when you have a set of seminal insights that you can actually validate in some serious way, not because it's a popular book, not because it sold 1 million copies, not because it got a lot of likes, not because it went viral. You actually enter into the source code conversation and you actually create a language which actually tells you a new story of reality that is so compelling because you actually can show that it's true in economics and that it's true in organizational theory and it's true in relationship theory and it's true in attachment theory and it's true in molecular biology and it's true in subatomic particles. You can actually show that there's a shared universe story that operates across platforms, and you actually begin to realize, oh, we're part of the same world. We're all part of the same story, and that story has value. It has intrinsic value because the universe generates value. So that's what I'm going to try and do, right, in the next few minutes. Give you just a fragrance of that story. And I'm smiling because there's something slightly absurd about trying to do a universe story in 15 minutes, but we're going to anyways, okay? Now, what we're working at on the think tank is, is the articulation of the story. And we've envisioned what we call a great library. Like, think about the Library of Alexandria. We've written about 17 volumes of it. There's about 15 to go, even though that's more than 30. And we're basically covering in a source code way, right, the entire gamut of human existence based on a set of simple first principles. Now, right, if you haven't tracked anything we're saying, that's totally fine. There's a perfect place to step in. Okay, complexity theory, systems theory, chaos theory. It actually starts with systems theory. The daughter is, right, when computers come online, we get complexity theory, and then chaos theory is a subset of complexity theory. So what's the basic principle of complexity theory at its core if you kind of strip everything aside? What complexity theory says is that simple first rules, simple first principles generate inordinately complex reality when you iterate those simple first principles again and again and again. That makes sense, everyone? You have simple first principles, you iterate them again and again and again, you get the hyperobject, which we call reality today. So what I described before as rivalrous conflict, win-lose success stories governed by a win-lose metrics, that's a simple first principle. The same way that in complexity theory, iterating a first principle generates exterior reality. So iterating a first principle, an interior principle, generates the quality and fabric of culture. So the story, in this case, success story, rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics, that's the simple first principle. In order to change the trajectory of the system, and I've spent, 20 hours a day the last decade thinking about this and read thousands and thousands of volumes. And so you're going to get this is a distillation. I'm talking the language of second simplicity here. It's language of second simplicity. If you change the simple first principles and you deploy that change, and then you can actually change the system. For example, democracy, right? 1,000 years ago, democracy would have been unthinkable, right? It was a complete absurdity. And yet in the last 300-400 years, democracy is, at least for half of the world, an axiomatic given, universal human rights, women voting, scientific method, right? All these were unthinkable until they enter into consciousness. And these are new, simple first principles. So we're at this moment where we're actually standing before the second shock of existence, not the first shock, right? The death, the potential death of humanity. We can't wrap our heads around it. It's, as Robert J. Lifton wrote in his book, it's unimaginable. So we turn away from it. Right? We're deadened, right, to that possibility. It couldn't be. So we turn away. We actually forsake the covenant between generations, and we go about our business as usual, which is beyond tragic. Right? It's not possible. We actually have to turn towards it. We have to actually access our capacity to imagine a new reality. The original Hebrew word, some of you may be familiar, for Adam and Eve was actually Adam. Adam contained, as it were, Adam and Eve. And the word Adam means two things. It means ground, adama, ground, and it means dimayon, imagination. So actually in the original text, human beings, homo imaginus, right? We have the capacity to imagine. So in this moment, we're in a crisis of imagination. And the part of you that's listening to me now that cannot imagine this, that's the crisis of imagination. It's too big. But yet that is what is. Right? We've never been ever in history at a moment like this, which is why we can't imagine it, because we don't know how to think. We think linear. We don't think exponential. Change is exponential. It's moving so unbearably fast, we can't actually see around the corner. But the capacity to see around the corner, right, is what it means to be homo imaginus. So I want to just suggest to you, and in the very few minutes we have, right, the very beginning core of this new story. Now, here's my promise. In the future salons, I'm not going to recapitulate again existential risk. Gabrielle and Sharif correctly and wisely asked me to recapitulate it this time. And I wanted to do it just to make sure we're on the same page. And I knew there was a bunch of new people. So that's the recapitulation. From now on, next 14 minutes, right, or whatever, I think 7:08, 8:08 is when we started. So 8:08, exactly 60 minutes, right? We're going to stop exactly on time. But from the rest of this time and all the rest of the salons, what we're going to do each salon is we're going to take a particular dimension of reality and unpack a source code evolution, right? A new structure of reality that's replicable, scalable, that becomes a cornerstone of a new story. So the new story becomes the basis of a global ethos for a global civilization. Okay. So let's start today just for a few minutes. Let's look at the first narrative, which is a universe story. Okay, ready, everybody? 10 minutes, new universe story. Okay, what's the current universe story? What are the universe stories available in the world today? Anybody? Two basic universe stories. One is a reductionist materialist universe story, which the basic building block of reality is matter, right, and nothing else. And it just happens to aggregate and births complex systems, but basically reality is, it's over when you die. Reality is fundamentally, in an ultimate sense, meaningless, and meaning itself is a social construction of reality. And for example, Yuval Harari, for example, who writes Homo sapiens, that's his basic position. And he says Libya's Gaddafi and universal human rights are both social constructions of reality. I want you to get the implication of that. And Bill Gates and Barack Obama endorsed the book as the best book ever. I want you to just kind of get that for a second. And it's the book that sold more copies, about 14 million, right? In the intelligentsia around the world, its basic position is, which is dogmatic, completely flawed. I don't have time now to kind of essentially rip apart and deconstruct everything wrong with that position, but it's about as wrong as saying the earth is flat. Yuval hasn't thought it through. He's a good historian, right? Not a good thinker about these things, but he makes the postmodern claim that there are no genuine values, that everything's a social construction, and that, as Camus said in the existentialist novel The Stranger, mother died today or was it yesterday? And what Camus means is it doesn't make a difference. And existentialism births postmodernity. So that's one position. Right? That's a position that no one in this phone call agrees with. And the truth is no one around the world agrees with, even the people that espouse it. Because even the people that espouse it actually live their lives based on value, based on a sense of choice, in a sense of love, and in a sense of meaning, as does Yuval, in a sense of enormous commitment. So the postmodern deconstruction of all value, it's all a social construction, that doesn't fly, doesn't work. Second possibility is one individual religion, right, has the exclusive truth, everyone else is wrong, and everyone's going to, in the end, observe that particular religion. They're all going to come around. Not a chance. And by the way, there's no real text. When you look at the real esoteric text and all the religions, right, no one actually believes that. That's not actually the genuine vision. If you read, I've got in front of me a text by Cook, right? Abraham Cook was the greatest mystic, right? Evolutionary mystic kind of figure within Hebrew Kabbalah, right? He thought that notion was utterly absurd. So what's our story? What's our shared story? It's not going to be one people imposing their story on everyone. It's not a materialistic reductionist story. What's the story? So I want to just try and say the story in several sentences. And it would take me a couple hours, which I'm not going to do now, to kind of validate it fully. We have 3 or 4 books coming out in the next 3 months that begin to tell the story that I've been working on with Howard Bloom, who you may know, by the way, who's the kind of the key scientist at NASA. He's a great guy and a serious and good thinker. But I want to try and say the story in just a few sentences, something like this, okay? And I'm going to say the story at a level of second simplicity. I'm going to give 2 or 3 examples of it and try and just kind of get the story in the space. So here's the story. This is a new universe story based on the best validated insights of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern knowing across all disciplines of gnosis, of knowledge. Here we go. Reality is not merely a fact. Reality is a story. Reality is not an ordinary story. Reality is a love story. Reality is not an ordinary love story. Reality is an evolutionary love story or an outrageous love story. 4 sentences. And that's you have to tell a story. Okay, reality is not a fact. Reality is a story. Reality is not an ordinary story. Reality is a love story. Reality is not an ordinary love story. Reality is an evolutionary love story. Okay, that's statement 1. I'm going to unpack it. Okay, I just want to throw another statement on the table, though, before I get to unpack those 3-4 lines. And those 3-4 lines, we've written now several thousand pages, unpacking with heavy footnotes those few lines. Okay, so that's not a fanciful conjecture. That's the best statement we have about reality today. Now imagine that we could actually, that statement became part and parcel of how people understood reality. I'm going to throw a couple of other pieces at you, and we're going to weave them together in very short order, but I want you to give you a fragrance of the whole thing. Okay, here's another statement. Okay, we live in a world of outrageous pain. The only response to outrageous pain is outrageous love. We live in a world of outrageous pain. The only response to outrageous pain is outrageous love. A Hebrew original of the term outrageous love is ahava azah, used by the psalmist. Outrageous love, not ordinary love. What's the distinction? Let's kind of enter through that door. What's the distinction between ordinary love and outrageous love? Or evolutionary love, another term, evolutionary love. But they mean the same thing. Or what, if you have a mystical bent, what any number of Kabbalistic texts over 2,000 years called the difference between love before creation and love after creation. Same distinction. Ordinary love and outrageous love, ordinary love and evolutionary love, or love before creation and love after creation. So ordinary love, or love after creation, right, is the experience of what we might call romantic love between human beings, which is lovely and sweet, but highly limited, right? It's not outrageous love. Outrageous love is not mere human sentiment. It's the heart of existence itself, right? Outrageous love is the love that moves the sun and the other stars. And outrageous love is the notion that there's an eros that animates cosmos, and that eros drives the whole story. So that actually, right, outrageous love or evolutionary love or eros is actually the core quality of existence itself. Now, that's a very big idea. That's a very big claim. Let's just look at it for a second, okay? Let's just play with it. And here's where we get to kind of a very, very essential understanding. Let's kind of play with this, okay? So love is not mere human sentiment. Love is the heart of existence itself. But we want to make that statement not as a conjecture, not as a fanciful claim, not as a declaration, not as a fundamentalist axiom, not as a new age affirmation, but as actually the best integration of all the sciences we have. Let's just take a look. Let's just kind of see how it plays. So 3 quarks. Let's just take a look at it, okay? So here's our statement. Let's just get it again, make sure we got it. Love is not mere human sentiment. Love is the heart of existence itself. So let's say you have 3 quarks. 3 quarks are in subatomic world. Quarks by themselves disappear. They don't exist. Quarks are actually allured to each other. Quarks are allured by what Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell at Cambridge in the 1920s, right? Quarks are driven by what Whitehead called the lure of becoming. Okay, now there are words for this in Sufi mysticism and Kabbalistic mysticism and, you know, in Kashmir Shaivism, but I'm going to use Whitehead's word, which is his scientific description. Reality is animated by allurement. Quarks come together because they're allured to each other and they form a new whole. And that new whole, depending on how that new whole is arranged, depending on the configuration of intimacy between the quarks, those quarks form either a proton or a neutron. Now stay with me. Then a proton and a neutron and an electron come together. What are a proton, neutron, and electron? Anybody? Proton, neutron, electron, those are subatomic particles. They're allured together. They could have just drifted by themselves in a different cosmos. They're allured together, and those subatomic particles form a new whole greater than the sum of the parts, which is called an atom. Wow. Then the atoms are allured together, and they form a molecule, and then molecules come together and they form a complex molecule. Then complex, right? So complex molecules come together, their intimacy deepens, intensifies, and voila, a cell emerges. So what is this process? So this core process, at the very core of cosmos, there's a structure which we might call allurement, or evolutionary love, right? Or eros, or what the Kabbalists call the love before creation. But whatever name you want to give it, you actually realize that there's an aggregating force in reality, which is not just technical structural, but has interior quality. It's the quality of allurement in which separate parts come together to form new wholes that are greater than the sum of the parts. Now, stay close for a second. What does that mean? And that same process continues, right, from single cell to multi-celled, and from multi-celled all the way up the evolutionary chain, all the way up, right, from plants, early plants, amphibians, early animals, later animals, mammals, all the way up to the human being, then all the way through the levels of humanity. You have this movement, which we might call the progressive deepening of intimacies. That actually reality is not just evolution from simplicity to complexity. I was recently talking, I was in, where were we, Christina? We were in Tuscany. And we were talking to one of the leading evolutionary physicists in the world. So I said to him, Irvin, describe to me the process of reality. So he says, reality moves from simplicity to complexity. I said, okay, what's complexity? I said, let me just change the word complexity. Complexity means more interconnectivity, more nodes of connection, and the interior of interconnectivity is intimacy. So think about reality differently. We spent a day talking about this, and he walked out just ecstatic, right? And he was 85 years old, and he'd been thinking about this his whole life. So just get the beauty of it, right? What is intimacy? What does intimacy mean? We live in an intimate universe. That's the core of the new universe story. We live in an intimate universe, and as we'll see in a couple of minutes, right, the intimate universe actually lives in us. What does intimacy mean? Intimacy, here's an equation. And this equation is as good as equals MC squared in the exterior sciences. This is the equivalent in the interior sciences. We live in an intimate universe. What's intimacy? Intimacy equals shared identity. Sentence one. Intimacy equals shared identity. So I get together with my wife, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. We have a shared identity. Plus a mutuality of recognition. We recognize each other. A mutuality of pathos. We feel each other. And a mutuality of recognition. Of purpose. We have shared function, shared purpose. So intimacy equals shared identity in the context of otherness, because we don't fuse. It's a union. It's not a fusion. So intimacy equals shared identity in the context of otherness plus sign in our equation. Intimacy equals shared identity in the context of otherness plus mutuality of recognition plus mutuality of pathos plus mutuality of purpose. That's the intimacy equation. Where does it apply? Everywhere. Subatomic particles come together. They form a new identity, shared identity. It's called an atom. The subatomic particles don't disappear, so it's shared identity in the context of otherness. The subatomic particles recognize each other. They feel each other. There's allurement between them. And then they create shared purpose, new function. That new function is called an atom. That's intimacy. That's the core structure of intimacy. Now, that structure of intimacy works in a couple, right? Shared identity in the context of otherness, union, not fusion, plus mutuality of recognition, plus mutuality of pathos, feeling, plus mutuality of purpose. It works in an organization. It works between nations, and it works between different parts of ourselves, right? We take the split off parts of ourselves and we create a new shared identity, right? We embrace a wider identity, right? The intimacy equation actually works across all platforms. We can actually legitimately say that reality is the evolution of intimacy, or reality is the progressive deepening of intimacies with wider and deeper fields of mutuality, recognition, union, and embrace. Okay, let's just see. Okay, we're at 7:59. We've got exactly till 8:08. Okay, so we're going to start exactly on time. Let's just see how this plays. So what have we done in a very short amount of time? We just placed at the center of reality a formula, and I want you to get the excitement of that. And we're going to make the argument that that formula you can use in economics, as I have with CEOs around the world. You can use it in molecular biology, right? You can use it in physics. You can use it in organizational dynamics. You can use it in personal interrelationship. You can use it in the governance of atomic particles, right? It's an intimate universe all the way up and all the way down. And that intimate universe lives in us, right? Meaning, what are we made up of? We're made up of quarks, right? And atoms, and molecules, hadrons, protons, neutrons, electrons, cells, multicellular structures, organisms, neural net, neural cord, right? In other words, all of those structures are, stay with me close, okay, are configurations of intimacy. What's a protein molecule? Anybody, what's a protein molecule? What is it? It's a configuration of intimacy. It's a particular relationship between sets of amino acids that have particular intimate relationship with each other. They exchange information. They exchange meaningful information. They're allured to each other, and they form a new protein molecule that's greater than the sum of the parts. That is the exact same thing as an organization. It's the same structure at play. So every crisis is an evolutionary driver. Every crisis is a crisis of intimacy. So the global intimacy disorder is just a crisis of intimacy writ large. How do you solve, right, a crisis of intimacy? You actually articulate a new story, which actually births new configurations of intimacy. That's what you do. So modernity, at a particular time in which the Black Death is sweeping Europe, modernity is devastated by the disenfranchising of huge dimensions of human population. Then modernity births a new set of stories which says, no, there's intimate relationship between parts, which can actually create new coherences, which is modern science. Universal human rights, let's re-enfranchise huge new groups of people. Let's re-enfranchise the feminine. Let's re-enfranchise the body, because in our intimacy disorder, in the moment of the Renaissance, we'd split off the body. We'd split off every other religion besides ours, right? We'd split off masses of humanity, which we didn't believe had unique dignity. There was no sense of universal human rights, right? And we'd split off nature, which we didn't believe we could actually examine directly and actually understand the configuration of intimacy that define it. And so the modern story was essentially a new story about how we do intimacy, right? And how we actually, right, articulate a new set of principles, a new set of tenets of intimacy. Every crisis at its core is a crisis of intimacy. Let's see if we can go one last step in the last 2 minutes, and we'll take any questions. So reality is the evolution of intimacy. Now, trust me, friends, right? If you're up for it, and if not, then totally good as well. But trust me, I could have given you a simple set of 4 sweet ideas here, which are exciting, popular, populist, delightful, right? You know, seemingly wildly relevant and transformative, and we would not have moved the needle at all. I have zero desire to entertain anyone, and we're not doing wisdotainment. So I know that I might have lost a couple of people, and I apologize, open heart, total apologies. But if you track what we did, right, we actually offered an organizing formula for reality. Now, that's one of about 7, but it's a formula that's actually about the interior value that lives deep within the structure of reality. And let me see if I can just go 8:04. Let's go 2 more steps in our next 4 or 5 minutes, then we finish. How do we know that love is a value? How do we know that love is real? Why isn't love just fanciful? Why isn't it just made up? Why isn't Yuval Harari right? Why isn't it just a social construction of reality? So there used to be something which tried to create a universal language called natural law. Natural law got shot down in the academy for 10 good reasons. You can't go to nature, right, to develop, right, a universal law. How do you actually articulate a universal set of principles that are a universal set of values? So stay close with me for a second. How do you articulate science? How do we do science? Science is based on the intimate universe. Science is based on the intimate coherence between the interior of the scientist and the interior of reality. Meaning mathematics lives in the interior of the scientist, and the interior of the scientist, which is mathematics, physics, etc., articulated, matches, as Einstein says, the great miracle of comprehensibility, matches the structure of cosmos. So there's an intimacy between the interior face of cosmos and the interior face of the scientist. There's no science without the premise of the intimate universe, meaning human science works because we're cosmic humans, meaning because our interiors participate in the inside of reality. It's a gorgeous idea. You can't understand science without it. In the same way that we derive science from our interior structures of our mind, we derive value from the interior structures of our mind. How many people on this call have ever listened to music? All of us. How many cultures have music? All cultures. What are 99% of all songs in all cultures all through time? Love songs, songs about intimacy. Wow. All right, so we have music. Music is the language of intimacy, and music's love songs all through culture, all through space, all through time. Why? Right, because music, right, is an expression of the core intimacy of reality. Complexity theory, computer-driven complexity theory, no less. If you know anything about complexity theory is actually the mathematics of intimacy. And as Pythagoras pointed out, mathematics and music are insides and outsides of each other. Wow. So this claim we're making that we live in an intimate universe, and reality is the progressive deepening of intimacies, and the intimate universe lives within us. Imagine if that claim became a de facto reality validated by the interior and exterior sciences, right, that transcended any individual country or nation, that was rooted not in conjecture, not in claims, not in assertions, not in affirmations, but in the best integration of all the sciences available. Meaning we could actually say reality is not a fact. It's not merely a fact. It's a story. It's a love story. And it's the story of the evolution of love. That's what reality is. Reality begins with intimacy and the evolution of intimacies, meaning intimacy means separate parts coming together to share a wider identity. Okay, it's 8:07. We've got 1 minute left. In the next 90 seconds or so, this whole thing comes home, but you need the next 90 seconds, then we're done. Okay, so I'm gonna give you the last big idea, which I absolutely shouldn't do, but I shouldn't give you the last 7 either, so what the heck? Okay, so here we go, last big idea. Okay, we got a drum roll here, we got a drum roll, last big idea. This is a big one. Okay, structures of consciousness. There are levels, there are structures of consciousness. Reality evolves. Evolution is the evolution of intimacy, right? And there are many lines of development. One of those lines of development is what we might call the moral line. So let me summarize in literally 90 seconds about 100 different developmental thinkers over the past 60 years. At least 100 developmental thinkers we've looked at. I'm going to summarize them in 90 seconds. There are 4 stages of consciousness over the last 1,000 years. Stage 1 or last 2,000 years. Stage 1, egocentric consciousness or egocentric intimacy, meaning my shared identity is with me and my family, the people I need for survival. I have a shared identity with, right, what's intimacy? Intimacy equals shared identity. I have a shared intimacy with my egocentric circle of intimacy, my family, my kids, a bunch of friends, a couple of business colleagues. That's the end of my circle of intimacy. That is true today for most Americans, right? That's true for most Americans, right? That's it. Egocentric circle of intimacy. True for most Westerners. Level 2, we expand the circle of care and concern, right? Egocentric intimacy. I only have a felt sense of love, care, and concern for me and my immediate circle. Level 2, ethnocentric intimacy. I have a felt sense of love, care, and concern, not just for my immediate circle of survival or thrival, but for my nation, my country, my people. I'm willing to give up my life for my tribe, my people, my friend, right? Not just my friends, but for the entire nation, the entire people. Ethnocentric intimacy. I have a larger circle of intimacy, my entire tribe, my entire people. Level 2. Level 3. Level 3. Now remember, when I'm at ethnocentric intimacy, anyone outside my circle, not part of my felt circle of care and concern, not part of my shared identity. Level 3, world-centric intimacy, right? 1985, Live Aid concert, We Are the World, right? Actually, I have a felt sense of care, concern, and love. I'm intimate. I have shared identity with every human being on the planet. Wow, right? World-centric intimacy. Last one, and we finish with this. Not just world-centric intimacy, cosmocentric intimacy, meaning I'm intimate with Earth itself. I'm intimate not just with human beings, but with animals at factory farms that are tortured. I'm intimate with, right, the entire world of sentient being. I'm actually identified with all cosmos itself, which is actually the essence of the mystical realization, the essence of Kabbalah, right? For example, if that's a tradition, you know, is that identity, cosmocentric intimacy. Wow, look what we just saw. We just saw a movement from egocentric intimacy to ethnocentric intimacy, to world-centric intimacy to cosmocentric intimacy over the last 2,000 years. What is that? That's the evolution of love. Wow, that's a story. That's an evolving trajectory. That's a plot line to Cosmos. Cosmos does have telos. Cosmos does have direction. We did move from quarks to culture. We did move from mud to Mozart. We did move, right, from bacteria to Bach. There's a direction, there's a story. Reality is not merely a fact, it's a story. It's not an ordinary story. It's a love story. It's not an ordinary love story. It's an outrageous love story. It's an evolutionary love story. And that is to say, Cosmos is the story of the progressive deepening of intimacies. Intimacy is the interior feeling of interconnectivity, right? Reality is defined all the way up and all the way down by allurement, which separate parts seek to create larger wholes. And that governs every dimension of reality all the way up and all the way down. Stop. Okay, we stop here. So first off, I want to open to any questions. It's 8:11. I'm 3 minutes late. So I owe you on the 3 minutes, right? So I was out of integrity there, so I apologize. 2, super appreciation for you listening to was not an easy ride. So I totally get that. And I can hear Gabriel and Sharif thinking to themselves, did people get it? He should have done something simpler. So I get that. I apologize, guys. Right. So I went deep in. So I totally get that. Right. Right. And I hope you got a fragrance, right, of what it might mean to actually articulate a new story and what it means that only a new story, right, has the power to change the trajectory of reality at this moment before the second shock of existence, right? Literally the potential death of humanity, right, of the entire future. So this is a moment of incredible urgency, not fear, but if I can translate a word from 19th century Hasidic mysticism, it's a moment of ecstatic urgency, right? Ecstatic urgency. It's like, wow. It's a moment where we can respond, we can do something, right, which has enormous, enormous, enormous impact. Boom. That's it. I turn to Gabrielle, I turn to Sharif, to any questions, any comments, right? Anything of any nature. Thank you.
No, Marc, thank you so much. That was a very deep dive, but incredible. And I wonder if anyone has any questions. I mean, I do, but we can deal with me later. Anybody want to pose a thought?
And you can also just rest in it. No obligations to anyone. And I know that we said an hour, which is supposed to end at 8. We started a little late, so people also could have places to go. But if there's anything I can help with, right, any question at all of any kind whatsoever, I'm fully open and delighted. Yay. Cha.
Beautiful. Dr. Gafni, thank you. That was incredible. Really, really enjoyed it.
Yay.
And it's all thinking. I think that there's a lot to process, and time, it starts sinking in, and one develops questions and thoughts and input, and really incredible. Thank you.
And I thank you, Sharif. And I would just add that in all of our future conversations, we're not going to, as I said before, we're not going to recapitulate existential risk. So next time we'll spend the entire conversation unpacking this notion of the intimate universe and of what the human being is in it. So, right. So in other words, going forward, it all kind of slows down, right? Where now we're going to try and drop in to the tenets of intimacy, right? The tenets, right, of the new universe story, right, across platforms. Okay.
Well,
Thank
listen,
you, everyone.
2,000 years in 90 seconds. It's pretty amazing. So,
Yeah. Jeffrey, did Jeffrey want to say something there? Or was he just waving goodbye?
If you're taking questions.
Please. Yes.
And this rule of attraction is always intimacy. So from quirks to planets to universes, whether I go in or outward, this intimacy and attraction is not always love. So we create some things, for instance, let's talk about nuclear energy. The pieces had to fit together. They weren't created with a specific intent in mind, but the outcome does not produce something that is always beneficial to mankind or to us as a species.
Right. Absolutely. So Jeffrey, your point. Go ahead, please.
Intimacy and love are not the same thing.
But absolutely not. So this is important. Okay. So it takes us into a much deeper area, but here's the 10 seconds. love, the way we understand love, is a later expression of an original force or movement towards greater intimacies. That is to say, shared identities, right, in which separate parts come together that are greater than the sum of the parts. Now, what happens is, let's break, because you said two separate things. One is you point out correctly that implicit in technologies, all the way up and all the way down, are intimacies, meaning separate parts come together to create larger wholes. What we do with those technologies, meaning the interior technology, right, that actually defines how we use them, right, actually governs what happens in reality. And what you're pointing to is a huge gap in the last 300 years in which exterior technologies have exponentially increased and interior technology has essentially frozen. As we made a bunch of gains right after the Renaissance. And since then, interior technology has actually taken a nosedive. So when you have a huge gap between interior and exterior technology, A. Two is the more complexity you have, the more pathology you have. So dogs don't get cancer, horses do, right? In other words, so the more a human being is awake, a human being experiences not only pain, but suffering, right? And so you're absolutely right that exponential technology creates exponential potential destruction. But that doesn't mean that there's not an evolution of intimacy, right? The evolution of intimacy takes place in the interior structure of cosmos, where essentially 200 years ago, there was no critical mass of human beings who were at world-centric consciousness. It didn't exist. Now you have a critical mass of human beings that's never existed in history before that are holding world-centric consciousness. That's a big deal. We've actually gone, right, from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to cosmocentric intimacy. That's a very clear evolution of love. But as that's happened, there's been a parallel evolution in the last 300 years of exterior technologies, right, which have exponential power. That's what brought us to the second shock of existence, meaning exactly the paradox you point out is exactly how we got to the second shock. So when intimacy becomes conscious of itself, it becomes love. So that's a big conversation, but just in one sentence, right? Intimacy awakens to its interior nature, it becomes love. Right? That's what love means, right? And that love is, in Kabbalistic thinking, that's called the love before creation. I first called it evolutionary love, but that's the structure.
So here's a question that bothers me. In this balance of, let's say everybody, this does work, and there's a small percentage of people can create a giant change. And I think, but we always have to have a balance. Nature is always balanced. The yin and yang of things, every positive electron has a negative proton.
Right. Allurement and autonomy, attraction, repulsion.
Right. All we need is 50% in one quark, and maybe we're winning the game, and something has told me that love always wins. The evil never wins, no matter what happens. The planet's destroyed itself before. It will destroy itself again, probably, but the love only wins. But how do you get everybody on a massive scale and yet have this balance of physics that has to exist, for on that scale, to maintain it,
So that's a great.
I ask myself and wonder, that balance of power is always shifting.
Right. And so here, this is a longer conversation, brother, but, and you're also a little bit more vague in this question, but let me just kind of just say one short thing. Love is, and Jeffrey, you point to something enormously important. Love is the balance between allurement and autonomy. Love is not pure fusion, right? Love is, attraction and repulsion. It's the precise balance between them. That's what creates intimacy. Intimacy is shared identity in the context of otherness, right? So the capacity to deploy a new universe story is absolutely available to us. We actually have to, though, root it, again, not in declaration, but in hard science and articulate it in a very clear way. Now, when we say love always wins, we got to kind of get seriously what this means. In other words, if we would lose access to the future, meaning if we would enter into the sixth mass extinction, which is a significant possibility, right? We would lose, trillions of people in future generations, trillions of expressions of goodness, truth, and beauty, right? All of the past would never be what's called in Kabbalah tikkun, as you know. The past couldn't be fixed. The present would come to an end, and all the future would never be born. That's an incredible responsibility. And it's, we have responsibility today for all the trillions of future lives and all of the good and all of the joy and all of the depth and all of the divinity and all of the sacred, all that, right, actually hangs in the balance. I mean, that's shocking. I mean, it's a shocking thing to wrap your head around. So what we do is we turn away from it, right? And so would there be a possibility of the world being sixth mass extinction and then in some sense revitalizing itself? Well, sure, that's possible. But the loss, right, is so incredible, right, so massive, so that not to take responsibility for it, right, is unimaginable. And it takes something to wrap ourselves around it, but we can. And that's what happened in the Renaissance. So imagine that Miami became Florence, right? And that actually we came together as imaginal cells here in Miami. Why us? Just because. Because here we are, Center for Integral Wisdom is now located in Miami with Gabrielle and Sharif as board chairs, with Jeffrey right on board. And we actually come together and articulate this new story and deploy it right in the world effectively, just like Davinci and his cohorts. How many people, we talked about last time, were involved in the Renaissance? 1,000 people were at the core of the Renaissance, according to Paul Tillich, who's a good reader of this period of history, about 1,000 people, right? Today, with exponential technology, with 200 people and right resources, you can actually change the source code of culture if you actually go about it in a serious way. That's shocking. So we'll hold it here, but and I love the conversation, Jeffrey, totally appreciate it. The enormity of tragedy and the enormity of promise, right? We're literally poised between utopia and dystopia, right? We're in this 11th hour of humanity, right? And most people are asleep. Like, for those of us who have the ability to kind of pick our heads up and see the big picture, so then we become the ones who are holding that responsibility. We become the ones who are right? It's not the scientists, it's not the seers, it's not the prophets, right? It's not the rabbis or the priests. It's those who can actually wrap their minds and hearts around this and who commit to engage, that will actually walk us through this next 11th hour. Okay, anybody else? Thank you, Jeffrey, super thank you. Yeah, super thank you. Okay, are there any other, right? And again, no obligation, right? This is, as Sharif said, needs to kind of settle in and kind of work with it and kind of hold it. Dawn, good to see you. Yay, right? Yay. Okay, and good to see everyone. So let's hold here. If there's any other question, I'll be glad to take it or comment. And if not, we'll just kind of hold it here gently and then gently close. Okay, yay.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Really
Thank you. We'll see you next month.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a beautiful
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye. Bye-bye.
Here, Richard. Bye, Jill.